That's Nick.
And that's Joseph. And today we're here to talk about Night Stalker, The Hunt for a Serial Killer, a new 4-part docuseries which will be available to stream on Netflix January 13th, 2021, directed by Tiller Russell.
The 4 episodes are about 45 minutes long each.
Yes.
So 3.5 hours worth of viewing. Mm-hmm. It's basically about the 2 LAPD homicide detectives who were at the center of the Richard Ramirez case, also known as the Night Stalker.
Yeah, yes, I think it's safe to say this is investigative procedural.
Yeah. I did not care for this at all. It did not give me what I needed. I don't even know where to begin. I guess if you are thinking that this is going to do a deep dive into the mind of a serial killer, you will be extremely disappointed. We get like almost nothing.
Correct.
About Richard Ramirez. We only actually see, it's not until the last episode that we even see like some footage of him during like a police lineup and an image of him, like a photograph.
We get a very, very brief overview of his childhood, which arguably
like super
was,
brief.
Very important to explain why he turned into the man he was.
I feel like this was more about, it's definitely more about the main detective, Gil Carrillo.
Yeah, so it's about Gil Carrillo and Frank Salerno, and basically their investigation, which began, a timeline begins March 17th, 1985, when the first spree, when Ramirez's first kill in LA started.
Yes. Ugh, okay. It just was so disappointing. Like all of the things that, and I know there has been criticism about docuseries and true crime series iconicizing criminals and serial killers, murderers. But it's fascinating to try to understand why people do these heinous things.
Well, I think, and there's a way that isn't lionizing or glorifying their actions either.
Right, and I know we often hear like, why aren't we focusing on the victims? But this documentary, I don't think does a good job of honoring the victims at all. It just kind of outlines who his victims were, and then for some of them, they have family members who can speak about them. Mm-hmm. We do get one person who survived a Richard Ramirez attack, a woman who was raped by him when she was 6 years old, which was a very, I thought, uncomfortable recounting. It was very uncomfortable to sit through.
As it should be, though.
As it should be.
I think that those.
But it did feel exploitative to me.
It was, but I think because of our sensitivity towards the subject, does that seem exploitive? Like she wants to be there. Saying that, I didn't get the sense that she felt she shouldn't be talking about it. And then they do return to her and she tries to explain how she's been able to live a fulfilling life, etc. But I think some of the adjacent participants to the victims, I think those are moving and notable. It's just that I wanted a more comprehensive overview, much like OJ Made in America. I think Ramirez really does warrant that because. And I think as we were watching it, I kept thinking, how come we don't talk about Ramirez the same way we talk about Manson and Ted Bundy and Dahmer, and even in how they are depicted in cinema and television? And it's because of how unromantic he is and how unromantic his victims are and how, there's kind of an unsaid, as a society we can accept that somebody wants to kill young white pretty women, like it's just like we accept that happens, but raping and murdering handicapped 80-year-old women and small children, and it's so uncomfortable that I think we don't want to look.
Well, getting back to this documentary and the structure of it, so we are introduced to Gil Carrillo. Mm-hmm. And we kind of get a look into like his childhood. we know more about him than Richard Ramirez. His childhood, his dad was very tough on him, and his goal was to make his dad proud. He went off to the military. He then entered law enforcement, like through LAPD.
Yeah.
he witnessed like some homicide detectives working and decided he wanted to do that. So after what's considered a short time, like less than 10 years, he was plucked to be part of the homicide division. And it was his second, was it his second? Oh no, I'm thinking of a Dateline episode. But he was pretty young in his career as a homicide detective when he came across the first Ramirez attack. So we get a lot of background on Carrillo. Then we're sort of introduced to Ramirez's attacks, and they use this sort of feature of like showing a graphic of like a map of Los Angeles and then sort of traveling to these other areas, which I hated because there's so much emphasis on like LA, LA, LA. The opening sequence of the docuseries is talking about the glitz and the glamour of the 1980s Los Angeles scene, but then there's this underbelly. So the reference that the map shows is always downtown LA, and then we travel to where his victims were. But most of his victims are like adjacent to LA, in cities that people, like unless you're from here, you wouldn't even know like where they are.
Right.
So it just seems so arbitrary that so much effort is spent explaining like Monrovia, Mission Viejo, like Whittier. I just don't care. It doesn't matter. Like we know him as like this Southern California killer. Okay. Like more energy was put on that than like explaining other things. Like how did he choose his victims? It just seems really random.
See, I didn't mind that so much, especially living in LA for almost a decade now. To me, there's an attachment of a meaning to all of those places now that I'm here. But what would that say to somebody living that's never been here? I don't know if it's effective, but I think it would have played better perhaps if it had been balanced in other ways.
So there's that. Then we get commentary from two Los Angeles news reporters, anchors, who were covering these cases, or this case back in the 80s. Mm-hmm. One is
Tony Valdez,
and the other is Laurel Erickson.
Yes.
So they just kind of provide narrative, basically. Laurel Erickson does have sort of a specific moment related to the case in that somehow
it also doesn't reveal how she knew that.
Well, let's step back. So Gil Carrillo, this is kind of shady of me to say, but I feel like he really didn't do much in the case except kind of link all of these random attacks and murders together because there was a common shoe print. And there could be a drinking game based on how many times we reference this Avia tennis shoe print. And that's kind of, I mean, I didn't know Gil Carrillo before this documentary, so it's the documentary's fault that my impression of him is all he did was find this shoe print.
I thought that he was kind of considered a laughingstock prior to that because he was theorizing that all of these random murders were linked and the shoe print wasn't really a part of the narrative yet.
Right, and also, you know, as we've learned from watching a lot of true crime things, like law enforcement needs to keep all of its cards close because if this person is listening, we don't want them to know what we know, right?
Right.
So Laurel Erickson, the one news reporter, contacted one of the detectives and said, like, I'm going to print a story or do a story telling everyone about this shoe print if you don't give me an exclusive. So that's kind of her role in it. Tony Valdez is just kind of like, he was a news anchor in the 80s when this was happening, so he's talking. That's it. We get a few outlying people, like a woman who was present when Richard Ramirez bought like this AC/DC cap that he was known to wear. We also get, there's some other, like a librarian who saw him once talking about remembering seeing him. Everything culminates because the documentary does a poor job of two things. One, as someone who remembers this in the 1980s living in Los Angeles, there was a brief period when this killer was identified as the Night Stalker and sort of the panic that ensued. Because prior to that, all these random killings weren't really connected. But the documentary makes it seem like it's very internalized with like Gil Carrillo and how he always knew. But it doesn't really explain, like, so much effort is put in the first episode of like how LA was terrorized by this, but it doesn't exemplify that.
Right, and also doing a good job of backing up to discovering that he was really started killing people in June of '84 in San Francisco. But it's his return trip to San Francisco where he kills Peter Pan, and Dianne Feinstein leaks the information about the shoe print connection. That is when the media really took off with it, I believe, my impression.
Yes. So things culminate with then Mayor Dianne Feinstein of San Francisco releasing pertinent information to the media or to the public. So now law enforcement feels pressure to figure something out. Mm-hmm. That's when they get a tip from it's very, even that, like such a big connection between someone had like a bracelet from a friend who knew. It's a very interesting web that the documentary doesn't take the time to breathe and really put it all together, and I think it doesn't do that because it takes away from Gil Carrillo. Because, let this documentary tell it, he is like
the linchpin, yeah.
But really, he didn't do much. What really cracked this case, I think, was someone brought to the attention that they knew someone received a bracelet from a person who knew Richard Ramirez, and then a San Francisco law enforcement agent approached that person in a really awkward retelling of how he basically threatened this man.
Brutalized him.
Like brutalized him. To then say this man's name. Yeah. And once they did that, and then because also fingerprinting and all that forensic stuff obviously wasn't as high-tech as it is now. So once they had Richard Ramirez's name, they could cross-reference his fingerprints, and that's how they got his mugshot. And it's when the mugshot popped up that he was caught very quickly because it was all over the news.
And they got the fingerprint finally from that one vehicle where he had adjusted the mirror.
The rearview mirror.
Yeah.
So I think the documentary is glossing over the parts that, like, I think it's it's almost like when you do a school project and you know it ain't shit, so like you focus on what you did do, but you're like, there are these glaring omissions that everyone's curious about. That's how this documentary felt. Like, really, the beauty of this case is how he was caught, because he was able to proceed and kill so many people because it was so random.
It was random, and it also multi-jurisdictional, so you had all these LA detectives competing for the fame and notoriety of cracking a case.
Plus, he was also attacking children, so that's an entirely different bureau.
Yes.
So yeah, I think that's what's fascinating, but then it highlights the inadequacies of law enforcement, so I feel like the documentary was not trying to do that.
I think it was trying to be an homage to law enforcement,
yes.
Which is why they spoke so freely about doing things.
Right. This feels like, I don't know, like when churches, like those mega churches make those propaganda videos. That's what it feels like.
Which is why I think it needed, there's enough material here to justify something much longer than 4 episodes, I think, that would cover all fronts, such as honoring the victims and their relatives, but also really delving into all these questions that automatically pop up, such as they discover that he's using ammunition that's got a red primer that is not manufactured anymore, and that's never returned to again.
Which is important because
that's how they link him to that gun that he gives away, the 22.
But also because Richard Ramirez, many of his victims who survived,
Yes. He shot a lot of people point blank in the head, and quite a lot of them survived. And so, was something wrong with the ammunition? There are all kinds of questions you have, and it's like you needed some other experts, maybe ballistics experts, I wanted somebody to comment on all those things.
Also, the question of like, how is he choosing his victims, right? Because we would speculate, but I would have appreciated some speculation. Like, really, we just go from like, oh, this night he went to this house, then this house, and just walked in and attacked these people.
Which also reminds me that this starts out on a very promising note. Ominous music. Even if you watch the trailer on Netflix with the eerie Bananarama Cruel Summer, like, saw that totally, I want to see this. But hints at the dipping into the underbelly of LA, which is always fascinating. but then fails to capture a portrait of LA in the 1980s, specifically these neighborhoods that are paramount to us understanding what this is like. Because I even read a short snippet of a statement from director Tiller Russell, who said, you can drive around LA even now and see bars on windows everywhere, and that's from this instance. But that's not even mentioned in the documentary, and I think that would go further in assisting with the mood of this time and this place.
Also, how Richard Ramirez was caught. So when his mugshot was released, he was caught very quickly because it was all over. He was on a bus and then jumped out and jumped into a neighborhood that was primarily like Spanish-speaking people. They recognized him after he attempted to carjack 2 people, and this one man like whooped his ass with a metal bar, and then the community came around and basically like
held him captive
until law enforcement could get him. I thought that was very fascinating, and the documentary does spend a little time, but I think it just seems so focused on the wrong thing, primarily like this one detective.
Carrillo.
Why do I know more about his childhood than Richard Ramirez?
Or even Frank Salerno, who was very infamous because he had worked on the Hillside Strangler case several years prior. So he was a kind of iconic homicide detective.
And I want to be clear, I don't not care about the victims. I think seeing a story that really highlighted these victims and the families and how this affected them would have also been very engaging and meaningful. But this documentary isn't that either, because the only victims we highlight are the ones who the documentarian has family members who can speak on them, because the other ones, it just goes like boom, boom, boom.
Right, yes.
Like we gloss right over them.
Most people and their adjacents aren't available.
Right.
But some of them are moving. The woman who was a child when her grandmother was beaten to death, I thought, it's hard to listen to that.
It is hard.
But going back to a point you made about not lionizing the serial killer, that was kind of a prime point in Random Acts of Violence, that Jay Baruchel film with Jesse Williams that we reviewed. If you remember, where he writes the comic book.
Oh, Jesse Williams, yes. I was thinking Jesse Eisenberg.
No, very different. But yeah, so keeping that in mind. But Ramirez, by sidestepping Ramirez, we get into all of these statements about evil incarnate. There's evil inside this man, blah, 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 blah. And even Carrillo talks about questioning him, and he started responding strangely when being questioned about his family, and he was afraid he was going to levitate. And it ignores the fact that Ramirez's childhood was paramount in what made him the man he is. Like, even just reading the Wikipedia entry about him, like the things that he experienced as a child, everything kind of makes sense, just knowing those things, that he was created by the environment around him.
I definitely think, even if this wasn't sort of a case study on Richard Ramirez, we needed more background on him. Also, if you're curious, I mean, the Wikipedia entry for Richard Ramirez has more about the victims in this documentary.
They provide a snippet. He was interviewed by Phil Carrillo on death row, and they just have the barest snippet.
That's what I was going to say. Like, the documentary does at certain points showcase audio of Richard Ramirez speaking, but it's more sort of like for accent. It really doesn't seem to provide any substance. Well, and then at the end, it's explained that he, we do sort of like it is said like, oh, this person interviewed him, and then we hear Richard Ramirez basically saying like, I hope you don't use this later. I don't want to seem like a bad guy. And I just thought like that audio would have been so fascinating to hear and to understand what this person said.
Well, they only use the shock value things because he talks about worshiping Satan and being a Satanist and how that gave him balance in his life, which is really no different. Like, you cross that out and put God, it sounds like what everybody else says. So I am not fascinated by what he's done because it's terrible, but I feel like, shouldn't we understand how he was created? I don't know. It just
if you ask me,
just saying that he's this evil man that had evil inside him. Because the only moment that evoked any reaction from you is that portrait of him.
You see a picture of Richard Ramirez shirtless with like staring directly into the camera,
with a woman describing his dark eyes. And
yes, and that was bone chilling. Again, I'm not saying that we have to like anytime we talk about people like serial killers, we have to get deep into what they were thinking and doing. But this documentary is like highlighting the wrong thing. I'm just really stuck on why I watched 3.5 hours focused on this like homicide detective who discovered a shoe print.
Sure, but you have to be. That's how these things come together. I did go off on like kind of a K-hole looking up other Richard Ramirez things. Of course, he was portrayed recently in American Horror Story 1984. There was a Lifetime movie with Lou Diamond Phillips, which I'd be very keen on watching. But really, I'm most wanting to see a 1999 television film called Manhunt: The Search for the Night Stalker, starring A. Martinez, who you know is Meryl Streep's lover in She-Devil, and Richard Jordan. I think that would be interesting to revisit. But
after watching these 4 episodes of Night Stalker, it just made me want to research other things about Richard Ramirez. I was not satiated by this documentary.
Because what he did is very troubling. That's why it's disturbing. It's like horribly disturbing.
Well, this documentary is this video's become very long. Anything else?
Was there anything that you liked about it?
As a native Los Angelino, it is fun seeing because that is my era. So like seeing the neighborhoods and the architecture and remembering that time, that had value to me.
Sure.
But I was generally frustrated. I just wanted more.
I did want more, which, it's always better to be left wanting more. I did like the soundtrack selections a lot. In fact, if there's anything that I took out of this that I loved is I hadn't been aware of an English artist named Anne Clark, who began in the early 80s, and it's a very effective track that's used by her, and I was going over her catalog today, but the soundtrack selection is fitting. It just feels like a tease because I wanted this so much more to be about all the components of Los Angeles and even San Francisco that assisted in creating what this man became.
Great. What would you give this docuseries?
2. I'm going to be nicer to it than you. 2.5 out of 5.
I would give it 2 out of 5. Anything else?
No.
All right. Bye.
Bye.